Working smarter, not harder, is the ultimate goal of productivity. It's something the sector will need to do to meet the challenges ahead. The Productivity Commission exists to provide recommendations on ways to improve and understand productivity issues. Its work considers whether laws, policies, regulations, and institutions that affect New Zealand's productivity can be improved. The Commission aims to lift New Zealand's productivity and, as a result, lift the well-being of New Zealanders. Our last speaker for Building Nations 2021 is Dr. Ganesh Nana from the New Zealand Productivity Commission. So Ganesh is a first-generation New Zealander, born and bred and educated in Wellington. His interest in economics originally emanated from his love of numbers, which in turn arose out of his passion for cricket. Ganesh took up the position of chair of the Productivity Commission after 22 years at the consultancy Burl. In 2018, he was appointed a member of the government-established Welfare Expert Advisory Group, which reported back in 2019 with Whakamana Tangata, restoring dignity to social security in New Zealand. Ganesh believes economics is fundamentally about people. Thank you, Dr. Nana.
Thank you, and kia ora. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for your time. Thank you for the introduction too. As said, I'm a first-generation New Zealander, and I'd first likely to acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua of Aotearoa, and acknowledge and pay my respects to all of your tupuna, my tupuna and our tupuna who have come here from lands far away many years, decades, centuries ago to build this nation and pass it on to the current generation of you and me. And it's incumbent on us to look after this nation and build it even stronger so that we can pass it on and to pass it on to the next generation and beyond in a good state. Here to talk about infrastructure and productivity and well-being. And if you're talking about words that might capture a broad audience and make them excited on a Friday afternoon, I can't think of three worse words, but infrastructure and productivity we got to think of some new words for those to build, to make them a lot more attractive, but we'll live for that. For now, I'll leave that for the comms people. But I love well-being, and that's why I've picked up this task. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about those things. I will warn you that I interpret infrastructure and productivity in a broad perspective, and that will come through in my talk to you today. Just reinforcing the purpose of the Productivity Commission. And this was the purpose from our legislation 10 years ago, which hasn't changed. And it's not, I won't say just about improving productivity. It's productivity is a means to the end, and the end is the overall well-being of New Zealanders, in particular, recognising the wide variety of communities of interest and population groups in New Zealand society. And I think that's the message and the perspective that I come to this challenge of lifting productivity, not just for productivity's sake, but for the well-being, and not just the well-being on average, but the well-being for everybody. And in there is quite a few challenges, and I like to posit this challenge about how do we lift our productivity here within this context. And what I'm going to put to you is just some core challenges that we face, and see how productivity and indeed how infrastructure relates to all of those. And I'm sure many of you could list a lot more challenges than these, but I sort of at the very high level identify these three core critical challenges from myself as a perspective as an economist, and indeed economist working for the Productivity Commission, and we can argue about which one's even more important than the others and whether I've missed out some, but these are the three that I think encompass the very disparate challenges that we now face. Climate change, I don't think we could argue about. It's been here for a long time, and we can no longer kick it down the road. And there are lots of dimensions of that climate change challenge in front of us. The workforce challenge, whether we like it or not, we are in competition for globally mobile labour, and that competition is only going to become increasingly intense over the next few years and indeed over the next couple of decades. And we have to think about how we as a nation confront that challenge. And then there's that challenge of maintaining our social license, and whether we're in the economics or the business sphere or in the public sector, or operating corporates or not-for-profits, that maintaining of a social license, that ability to engage and do activities, is something that most of us take for granted. But I think we recognise that definitely over the last decade or so, that social license has frayed. It's frayed a lot worse in many other parts of the world. So we here in Aotearoa are well placed to pick up on that and make sure that we maintain that and not have the negatives when that license frays even more. What I want to bring we'll come back to those three challenges and see how we can weave them together in terms of the role of infrastructure. But the word in there that I think I'd probably highlight is investment, and we can talk about that in a second. Just further on context, and I'll just use the work that's currently in front of the Productivity Commission, which is an inquiry into immigration. And just use that as context to go to infrastructure in a second. In terms of context, undoubtedly New Zealand has experienced relatively high population growth by international standards. There we are on that graph where there's New Zealand about 4 to 5 from the highest on the left-hand side of that chart, with many others below us, and indeed we are well above the world and indeed well above the OECD average in terms of population growth. And then if we add even further, not only is it just population growth, but by international standards, the component of migration is a lot higher than natural increase in New Zealand compared to many other parts of the world. And so that's the context within which we have population and migration growth. In particular, the last decade, we've seen a bit of a difference in terms of migration. We've I think we've addressed some of those workforce challenges, or at least tried to, by increasing the number of temporary migrants over the past decade. We could argue whether that was a proactive policy response or it's just something we stumbled into, but that definitely has happened. And that's showing through in terms of our workforce. In terms of over the last decade, in terms of our workforce, the growth in our workforce that the New Zealand economy has been able to access has been in that temporary migrant category. The workforce coming from New Zealand citizens and from recent permanent residents, migrants, is relatively small in the total scheme of things. So there's been a change in the nature of our migration and our population growth quite considerably. What does that mean for infrastructure? I think that's one of the core points we've made in our preliminary findings that we put out just a couple of weeks ago in terms of our immigration inquiry. And many argue it's almost a chicken and egg situation. Do we need the infrastructure first and then we have the population growth, or do we have the population growth and then the infrastructure? Whichever way we look at it in terms of the last 10, possibly 20 years, is this infrastructure deficit, which alongside the associated pressures with that infrastructure deficit is that failure to align our investment rates with that population growth. And we can point fingers as to who is or isn't responsible, but underneath it all is the New Zealand, whether it's government or community, our collective inability or unwillingness in the past to fund that infrastructure means that our recent migration growth is not sustainable into the future. So bluntly, if we're looking at tackling that workforce challenge, and there is one, we can't grow all the skills we need domestically or internally, especially if we recognise that many of the skills that we grow internally have a habit of shifting offshore every now and again. We would like to attract migrants, but we can't do as much as we have done in the past in that area unless we're willing to do the infrastructure beside it. And when I use the word infrastructure, it's not code for housing. It is broad infrastructure. Yes, it includes housing, but it's all those other things that we need to bring in terms of that infrastructure, I suppose, effort. And the word there is in there also is investment. And the other, I suppose, core finding is to extract it out from the migration and the population growth story, for want of a better word, and actually be quite upfront about it. Improved funding and building of infrastructure, bluntly, would have significant benefits, both to the well-being and productivity of New Zealanders and those who live in New Zealand and those who wish to New Zealand, irrespective of the immigration levels. And I think that is critical. The infrastructure that we need, that whether you call it a deficit or whether it's a challenge, we need to do it. We have to do it. Actually, we have very little choice, especially given the mismatch we have in terms of population and workforce and migration that we've experienced, and the infrastructure that we currently have. A fair bit of the I would say unfortunately, but a fair bit of the infrastructure investment that we need to do now is the catch-up stuff, which is not the greatest place to be, because in my opinion, investment in infrastructure should be for tomorrow rather than for yesterday, but recognising we're not starting from the ideal situation. So we do have to do a fair bit of investment to catch up, but ideally, with a bit of luck, we will start investing in terms of infrastructure, whether that's housing, whether that's skills training, or whether that's the other bricks and mortar, or whether that's the investment in R&D and education and health and other things, hopefully for the future rather than the past. Just in terms of that broader connection, I think the worry that I have, or worry, I suppose the concern, and that concern maybe also a little bit of an overstatement, but let's not forget, or let's not put infrastructure in the same place as immigration in the context of operating in its silo. We've got to recognise that immigration needs to be connected and linked to all the other challenges that we've got in front of us in terms of the immigration choices we make as a nation and communities. Similarly, infrastructure, we should not think of it in isolation to itself. It's more than just the bricks and mortar, and it's more than just the physical connections. To make the infrastructure that we decide on, to make it work, it's got to be operating and implemented in the context of where we are now and where we hope to be as a nation. And so we've got the climate and nature, natural and other ecosystems we've got to grapple with. We've got that community relationships, the license to operate. We've got the international connections that we want to encourage. There's that effort in science and R&D, and then there's recognising that there are a disparate and I suppose diverse range of knowledge and experiences of communities and people that we want to bring in to these infrastructure decisions. So we've got to go beyond just looking at them as physical bricks and mortar, because it is beyond that. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm also talking about the community infrastructure, those community networks. Some people call it soft infrastructure, but it's very important that we invest in those as well as the physical infrastructure. The reason I put this, the reason I choose that, the picture of the Auckland Harbour Bridge, I find that that's quite close to my heart, because it literally was open pretty close to when I entered this universe, and I find it quite, I won't say ironic, but quite signal in terms of the way we've done infrastructure as a nation. There it is, our one crossing of the Auckland, of the Waitemata. We chose the cheapest option at the time. Well, we chose a cheaper option. We took away the trains, and within 10 years, it was too small. So we had to tack on some extras. And dare I say, 60 years later, we still haven't got another crossing over the Waitemata, irrespective of the development of Tamaki Makaurau and surrounding communities and needs. It's in my opinion, a clear example of investing for yesterday rather than investing for tomorrow. And without being too critical, I think that's just an example of where we need to think carefully about, are we brave and courageous enough to invest for tomorrow rather than always continuing to think about catching up. And in that context of bringing things together and thinking about tomorrow rather than catching up, I go to the Treasury Living Standards Framework, and there's a bit of a complicated diagram on that slide, but I just, in terms of the framework that Treasury is now utilising or developing even further and utilising, and this is a very new version of it, and it has the top couple of elements of that slide, various measures and dimensions of well-being and the institutions that we all operate within. But and those are important, but I just like to focus towards the bottom of that diagram and what we term, or loosely term, the wealth of Aotearoa New Zealand, which we could encapsulate, and which Treasury have encapsulated in this framework into those four, what economists like to call capitals, but what other people would probably call concepts. There's that natural environment, the land, the water, the ecosystems. There's the financial and physical capital, so that's the bricks and mortar and the resources available to expand them and maintain them. There's human capability, so that's you and me and the experiences and our skills that we've acquired. And then there's that social cohesion and the rules and the regulations that most of us abide by that make it easy to do business, make it easy to generate wealth and well-being. And surrounding all of that wealth is a culture that enables us to apply our resources in an appropriate way. And without that culture, we lose our social license and other aspects of it. And that just, in my opinion, the reason I put that up is to reinforce that we need to spend in the broader sense, or we need to do investment across each and every one of those elements of our wealth to maintain them and to improve them. And so that's what we've got to work with. And I think we have, for want of a better word, not been great in investing in these. We've been great at probably trying to go for want of a word, the cheapest financial options when we look at investing in them. And when it gets too hard, we kick the can down the road. And obviously the natural environment is the prime example of that. But let's not forget that we've got to do a lot of investment in our human capability to maintain it and improve it. The financial and physical capital will be closest to your heart, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then also that social cohesion we cannot take for granted. The other element that, if we're talking about investment in infrastructure, that I just put in front of you is a different framework that similarly Treasury are also working on with some assistance, that Aotearoa framework, which is a pathway to well-being, which is sort of, rather than looking at it from an inputs perspective, which is what the previous slide in, these are the resources we have available. This slide here is very much from I would interpret very much from the aspirations perspective. So if we're doing investment in infrastructure, do they abide by, or are they consistent with the aspirations that we have in terms of, as a nation, where do we want to head? And some of those aspirations are listed there in terms of mana taututu, in terms of that aspiration that everybody needs to participate and be connected, and actually not only have rights but obligations, not only to participate but to contribute. Mana ahinga, which is that opportunity and capability that we need to invest in our people, but also provide those opportunities and ensure that where they have the capability, they are able to contribute. Mana whanake, which is around, yes, we want to generate income and we want to generate wealth. And so it's providing jobs, but it's providing jobs that are at good incomes as opposed to some of those other choices we've made in the past. And mana tuku iho, that sense of identity and belonging. let's not forget critically that, again, that infrastructure that we're all providing is not just bricks and mortar. Infrastructure enables these aspirations to be realised. And I think we've forgotten about that aspect of our, for want of a better word, our cost benefit analysis when we do the program assessments and we try and build the case to get the expenditure over the line. We have a habit of ignoring the, I suppose, the enabling aspect of infrastructure and go to the, unfortunately, dare I say, to the one that provide or might seem like that cheapest option or that cheapest financial option from that resource perspective, in terms of what resources we're using up to do that investment. But what about the opportunities we're losing if we don't do the investment? In terms of infrastructure, then the critical element is around our behaviour. And the reason I put those two previous frameworks up is to encourage that change in behaviour, that change in the way we look at infrastructure opportunities. They're not about spending dollars to get dollars back. They are about, when we're talking about network infrastructure, infrastructure for the nation, whether it's in our people or whether it's in the bricks and mortar, we're talking about enabling future opportunities. And I think that's where that focus on the long term is critical. And that's where I prefer the perspective on that wealth rather than the incomes we're generating today. It's the wealth that we've got to look after and maintain for future. And that's why we are investing for today, for tomorrow, rather than the looking in the mirror backwards, in the rear vision mirror about what we have to make up for. So yes, it's maintaining for today and tomorrow, but ideally, let's start looking about what sort of assets do we need for tomorrow. And in that, from a boring, dull economist or even a financial perspective, I seriously have always questioned fundamentally, why do, as economists or even just business case analysts, why do we continue to discount future benefits? A discount in the context of valuing the future less than a current benefit. I would say seriously and openly, if we are serious about intergeneration well-being, if we're serious about delivering well-being for the next generation, we cannot afford to discount the future. Those future benefits, however uncertain they may be, must be in the equation with at least equal weight as the current generation. And I think that's part of that conversation that we need to turn our mind to. We need to value quality. We need to think seriously about what have we lost in chasing those low-cost options? What have we lost in that race to the bottom? Where and who have we, or what opportunities have we lost in not hearing everybody that should be at the table? And in particular, the one group in our community that are never at the table, and that's the generation that's not born yet. And let's not forget, most of our infrastructure, we're talking seriously long lived infrastructure, will be for the people who are not born yet. But again, I go back to my previous point. In terms of the equations and the models we still have embedded in those models a framework, or dare I say, a perspective that discounts those future benefits. And I seriously question that perspective right from the start. And let's start valuing outcomes rather than, I suppose, nodding to the future and talk about well-being. Yes, well-being is important. We might not be able to measure it in strictly quantitative sense from the second down to the second decimal point, but that doesn't mean it should not be in our equations somehow, or at least within our decision matrix. It's critical that we confront these. But so I go back to those challenges that we have, those challenges that I listed right at the very beginning are not new. For some of them, we've kicked the can down the road for too long, because I would argue we have valued today way more than we've valued tomorrow, which has tilted the playing field away from infrastructure for the future. We need a business framework, economic framework, a public policy framework, and, dare I say, courageous industry and community and political leaders that are prepared to value the future much more than they currently have. And so we do need to get away from this productivity perspective of working longer. Working longer is wrong, and that's an indication that our productivity equation is not working, or our productivity decisions is not working. If we're serious about productivity, it is about investment in those resources, the human capability, the natural environment, yes, the physical connections and the bricks and mortar, but connected to those social cohesion. If we do the infrastructure properly and proactively, we will enable and improve that social cohesion, because it's through infrastructure we open those opportunities to those groups and communities that in the past have been excluded. It is all about investment, investment in the broadest sense. Some of it's got to do with, well, a fair bit of it's got to do with dollars and cents. A fair bit of it's got to do with dollars and cents today rather than tomorrow. The benefits won't come through for a while. That's the big question. Are we prepared to do that, or are we going to continue down the road of being unwilling to invest for future generations, even though we say we are? I'm happy to leave it there and leave the time for a bit of conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ganesh. We've got quite a few questions, so I think I'll fire straight in if that's okay.
Go for it.
The Infrastructure Commission has recommended a national population plan in its draft infrastructure strategy. What's your opinion of that, and what do you think such a plan or strategy should include?
That's a very live conversation happening within the Productivity Commission itself, and that obviously links clearly to the immigration inquiry we're currently doing. And I suppose the academic in me would say quite openly that it's very difficult to have migration settings if you haven't got a bit of a framework around, and I won't call it a population target, but at least some parameters within which we're working, and that goes back to infrastructure as well. I recall quite a few, it was probably about 15 years ago, when I was on a bit of a junket tour of Hong Kong and talked to some officials over there around infrastructure planning and cost benefit analysis and decision making, and the conversation or the question was pointed at me quite directly. It says, well, for what population are you building your infrastructure for? And I was at the time a little bit flummoxed, but it is a very critical question. Do we have at least an indication of what is the range of population? I hesitate to go to a specific population target, but I would say probably population growth, an indicator, or within some sort of high and low bands. One of the key problems with it, and I'll acknowledge it openly, is that we as a nation and definitely as government have very few levers to actually control population growth, because we can't control the inflows and outflow literally across the Tasman. And there's a large outflow, New Zealand, very peculiar, large outflow and inflow from Australia. And that sort of can mess up your population growth. But there are other levers we could use. I would say, as long as we keep that to the medium and long term rather than consider them short-term population targets, I think that definitely has got to be in the equation. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. How can New Zealand improve its productivity instead of lagging behind the rest of the world? You said this in your presentation, but yeah.
Well, I don't want to repeat what I just said, but it is around investment, undoubtedly. I mean, but I do think that there's not one single solution. Everybody, and I've been in this game for a lot longer than the Productivity Commission has been in existence. Productivity Commission has been in for 10 years, but this challenge has been here for a lot longer than that. And every time you get asked, what's the one thing we should do? There is no one thing. There's a package and a combination of things. But if push comes to shove, I would say it's investment for the future. And whether you talk about that in terms of bricks and mortar infrastructure, or whether you talk about investment in people, in our human capabilities, in the international connections that we want to invest, you can sort of, I wouldn't say you could pick and choose those, but those have got to come together in a package. And we got to do that seriously at scale, which, dare I say, requires some seriously different decisions being made now, recognizing that the benefits won't come through for quite a while. We cannot assume or we can't pull the wool over our eyes and say we're going to solve this productivity problem in 2 years. We'll be, I would say, probably not even 5. You know, you're talking serious change, step change. That takes a while. Are we in it for that long haul? Are we patient enough?
Picking up on people, how do you think our workforce can increase productivity?
Well, again, I go back to investment. If we're talking productivity, we're talking investment in skills, and you're talking, for want of a better word, I don't want to point fingers, but you're talking about our education sector and effort, but both the compulsory education sector as well as the pre-compulsory, as well as the post-compulsory, that whole broader education, training, skills element, but don't take that out of the context of the communities around them. We don't, as individuals and as humans, we don't get the skills to contribute just in a classroom or just on our own. It's within the context of the communities we operate. So we've got to recognise the advantages, the benefits and the assets that are within the communities themselves, and also recognise that there are many communities that lack those assets and we need to invest in them. That's what I mean by that soft infrastructure, those community infrastructures. So yes, invest in our people, but also, dare I say, what's the word? Let's not forget that, and I've just come off another session earlier today, indeed, that a lot of our ability to contribute is set within the first 1,000 days of our life, you know, the first 3 years. So again, are we prepared to invest then? And that's not going to change. It's not going to change the workforce for another 15 years or 20 years. But that's has potential to give us a serious step change. And that's what I mean by investing for the future.
Great, thank you. If you don't discount future benefits, won't you end up building projects today that aren't needed until decades in the future?
That's a risk. Yeah. And that's where I suppose, yeah, and I know there's the argument you'll build a whole lot of white elephants and stuff like that. And I think that goes back to your first question about a bit of a population framework that you're operating to. But and I go back to my Auckland Harbour Bridge example, we literally put in that infrastructure because we knew the area was going to grow even further. We knew, whether explicitly or not, we knew that was going to be the biggest city for the country for a few years, if not decades ahead. Where was the foresight, and I won't use the word planning, but where was the foresight about the supporting infrastructure that was required? We've known climate change has been here for a while. I remember hearing about climate change when I was first at university, and so that was a while ago now, and the prof said, oh, don't worry about it, we'll have 50 years to adjust. By my calculations, we've used up 40 of those. So yes, there's a risk that we use infrastructure, we do some investment that's not great, but that's the nature of investment. There are going to be some that won't be successful. And so yes, there's risk, undoubtedly, but let's not continue to go down we've got this idea that the least risk or the low risk option is the lowest cost. Well, the low risk option actually may well be that highest cost in terms of what we've lost as an opportunity, and now what we have to make up even more. So undoubtedly we won't get it always right, but if we've got that view to the future, if we do our analysis and bring in broader perspectives, hopefully we get more right than we get wrong. That's the nature of investment. Financial investment, there's always some that lose.
Do you think then we should be investing in Auckland Light Rail at this time?
Well, I'm again old enough to remember Sir Dovemeyer and Robinson's idea of like, well, whatever he called it back then. And that was, I can remember a cartoon of someone basically had him sitting on some flying pigs when that came out however many decades ago. So light rail, I hesitate to point at one thing, but within the context of a well-formed transport infrastructure plan for Auckland, with looking to the future. And if we're going to do it, let's do it seriously. Let's go all in, but then also at risk of offending other parts of the country, let's make sure it's not just Auckland.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to people, what about retraining and upskilling adults and managers, even which was some of Francis Valentine's advice the other day? So it's around, I think this question's around the aging population.
Yes, and that's a challenge in front of us. I suppose we did some work around future of work, and people are talking about changes to the lifestyle and work. And I think we also probably need to have a think as a nation about what do we mean by employment, given the nature of the labour force and given the way, in terms of global forces, the way employment and labour markets are changing, and indeed how do we respond to an ageing workforce. But let's not also forget that there is subcomponents within our workforce that are changing in the other direction. And so, yes, on average, there's an ageing workforce, but also within Māori and Pacifica, there's a workforce that's very young. And I would argue quite strongly that when we're talking about investment in skills and training, and it's a bit of jargon, but one size doesn't fit all. We have to think about retooling our skills training packages, our effort, to make sure that it's going to be successful for that growing community, that growing population group, as well as whereabouts does the ageing population fit within that future of workforce. And I would say quite openly, let's stop thinking about you have to work 40 hours a week full time in a job to contribute. There are many other ways of contributing. You don't always have to be in the paid workforce to contribute. Let's recognise the contributions of the unpaid as well. And that's that different perspective on well-being. So let's capture all of that effort within that wealth of the country that we have. And so there's a lot to pass on, but there's a lot to change. And let's also not put the pressure on the ageing workforce to say, oh, we've got an ageing workforce, you've got to stay in the workforce for longer because we can't replace you. Well, that's no way of lifting productivity. Yeah. People want to stay in the workforce longer, that's fine, but it's got to be that genuine choice.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on the relationship between flexible working and increased productivity, whether that is to do with hours or shorter working weeks, and does New Zealand need to encourage more of this?
Well, that's coming off that last conversation we just had. Yes, obviously. Well, flexible work environments, I remember hearing about that quite a while, but we're still in that sort of 35, 40 hour a week model. Still, many of us have still got that mindset. And it is a bit of a challenge because it's quite, I suppose, confronting for many because it's way outside our comfort zone. It's different to normal, and many of us like to be, have these strict boundaries and they're comfortable within those boundaries so they know whereabouts they lie. But I suppose we've got to recognise, and it's scary, but the world has changed and the world is not going to stop changing. We are all living longer, and we can argue about whether that's a plus or a minus. Not all of us want to retire at 60 or 65. Not all of us are able to even make it to that far. So we do have to, I suppose, grasp that flexible arrangements. We've got to figure out a way that's going to work for all of us. And that's where I go back to my perspective on productivity being about well-being. productivity improves when it delivers well-being both to the community and the individual and the business and the corporate. And I'll find if someone's feeling well, they're inevitably more productive, irrespective of how many hours they sit at the desk for or on the shop floor. And so there's that, and there's a balance. But the fact that someone's only working 25 hours a week doesn't necessarily mean they're being less productive. They could actually be a lot more productive if they have access to good childcare arrangements, don't have to worry about putting food on the table, don't have to rush off early to pick up the kids from somewhere else, or have the ability to participate in some community groups, or look after the local cricket team or whatever it is, those sorts of things. And it sounds fuzzy and some people don't quite like it because I'm justifying unpaid labor, but it is part of that equation that we do have to make, dare I say, we have to make working a lot more attractive than it currently is. Well, paid working, for want of a better phrase. Because we've tried the lifting productivity by just the straight incentives. We'll pay you more if you can deliver more. Well, that doesn't work, because there are a lot more other things that we can use and do to incentivize people to work, I suppose, more productively.
Yeah. Moving on to unpaid work, how does valuing unpaid caregiver work in that equation, and what value might that add to our understanding of the productivity equation?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that's that unpaid work, I suppose that's in those aspirations in that well-being framework that I put up. The unpaid work, unfortunately, within some of our conventional models, is still seen as a nice to have sort of thing. We'll do the productivity and we'll get the high wages, and then we can afford to take time off. And I think that sort of linear approach to our model has been proved wrong. It just, because we never get to the productivity growth, because if we can't afford the unpaid work, if we can't afford to look after our children, if it's always a struggle to get the quality childcare, it's always a struggle to spend time with your kids and looking after them and having fun and seeing if they're engaging at the school, all of those sorts of things, we're never going to get to a productive workforce, because they've always got other things on their mind. They're always thinking like they're chasing their tail. So we need to put them together, and I suppose that's why we can't put productivity in a silo and then put the higher wage thing in another silo, and then we put the well-being in another silo. They are connected. It makes our decision making a lot harder. I won't say it's going to be easy. It was a lot easier just do that linear model. But I think we can argue about the evidence, but I would argue that linear model hasn't held up well. It hasn't delivered what we were expecting. So we do need to be a lot more nuanced and provide people with the opportunities to, yes, the unpaid labour is important. We put that in the equation, whether you put that as explicit, sabbaticals, or call it what you like in terms of your employment arrangements or training and development. In terms of sabbaticals, I literally, as I say, I don't care where you work from. If you're, and I'm reasonably privileged enough, I don't need to work from a specific place. If I'm way more productive sitting on a beach while I'm thinking about things, do it. If my staff go there, I don't mind. If it not only builds on your well-being, but also will make you productive, because it's a lot more conducive environment. If you have to be at a particular station, that's fine, but it doesn't really matter when. Work it around your other obligations, unapologetically, that sort of element. That's what valuing unpaid work means.
Yeah. One final question, Ganesh. How do you think the impact of the brain drain, especially to Australia, is going to have on our productivity, and how can we mitigate this with, in terms of skill shortage with the borders opening up?
Again, well, that's not a new challenge. I mean, it's been with us for a long time. It's only going to, I won't go too gloomy, but it's not going to go away fast. Undoubtedly, Australia has a lot more, I won't say a lot more, but has some attraction advantages over us. one of them being the pay packet, undoubtedly, but also the opportunities that provides people as well. I mean, you know, you can play in a bigger pond, for example, and you have the opportunity to make differences. But I think we've also got attractions here that I think we, as a nation, we underplay. And ideally, we want to build on that wage differential, or not build, we want to eat away at that wage differential. But also there are those other attractions that I think we should play up a lot more. And that's why I say not being apologetic about the non-wage thing, the unwaged, you know, all those attractions. I think we should be openly attractive to that and actually build on the networks and the connections we've got internationally. And I would argue one of the biggest attractions that we underplay quite a lot is that social cohesion element that we have got. Won't talk about the last couple of weeks, but that thing that we take for granted. I think that's an offer that we do have here in Aotearoa that we can use alongside the characteristics of New Zealand that are not available anywhere else, and whether that's Maori or whether that's other elements of our community. If we're serious about the long term, that's the package we've got to put. Short term, yeah, we are going to be short of, whether it's health professionals or construction professionals and those sorts of things. That's a challenge, and there's no simple solution, but we can't continue the short-term sticking past a solution of immigrants and then expect that to then change in the long term. We've got to also do the long-term stuff.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks, Ganesh. I could talk to you all day and keep putting questions at you, but I'm also conscious that it's Friday afternoon and you probably want to get out in the sun, and you're
Absolutely.
not in lockdown in Wellington, so you can go out and do things. So, yeah. But thank you.
Thank you. And well done to all those in Tamaki Makaurau. I have relations up there, and I won't say no, I know what it's like, but my heart goes out to you, and all the best, and I'm sure we'll get through this together. Kia ora.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye. See you. Well, that's us at the end of this now. So thanks again to today's speakers and sponsors, EY, Auckland Transport, Jacobs, Becker, Watercare, and Tonkin and Taylor, and of course to our premier sponsor, ANZ. So that's brought us to the close of Building Nations 2021, and it's my pleasure to formally close the proceedings. We hope you've enjoyed the last 4 days, and we've taken plenty away from more than 100. I'll say that again, that's more than 100 participating speakers, panelists, and facilitators. The fact that we've had more than 770 delegates attending across the 4 days, more than we'd expect if we were doing this event in person, suggests that the online format has worked well. Just like our sector, we were not going to deliver it if we were not prepared to do things differently. We really had no alternative. As our chair, Margaret Devlin, alluded to in the opening Building Nations on Tuesday, delivering a virtual conference was a new thing for us, and we did it in a very short time frame. Building Nations has been delivered by a very small Infrastructure New Zealand team working in lockdown in Auckland. And I want to say thanks to my awesome team, Katrina Barrick, Paige Hallam, Azim Khan, Martina Moroni, Katerina Fakas, Nicole Seedon, and Phil Barclay. And I also want to say thanks to the support from Tara Daly and Nihal Fernandez at the conference company. I also want to say thanks to Richard, Waiwai, and Otene Reweti for their beautiful mihi and karakia each day this week. Thanks also to the Infrastructure New Zealand board, and particularly the chair, Margaret Devlin, for her support since I was appointed as General Manager in July. With the new format, we also sought to really raise the bar on the content and speakers. And over the last 4 days, we've heard from the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, several Cabinet Ministers, opposition MPs, international and New Zealand experts, and we think we've covered all the big issues, the controversial ones and the topical issues, particularly relevant to our sector now, as well as those still emerging. We were deliberately ambitious with our programme, but we think we've delivered a fantastic lineup, and we're already mindful it will be a tough standard for next year. Thank you very much to our speakers, panelists, and facilitators, and we're very grateful for your efforts and for your time. We've received a large amount of positive feedback as Building Nations 2021 progressed, which we've been really encouraged by. We appreciate all your feedback and we'll be formally seeking further feedback on the conference so we can do better next year. We hope we'll be meeting in person, not battling lockdown hairdos and working from home with toddlers, dogs and cats. I also want to say a massive thank you to all our sponsors, including our premier sponsor, ANZ. We could not deliver Building Nations without your ongoing support, and we're particularly grateful you stuck by us when we made the call to deliver the conference virtually. It feels very early to be talking about next year's Building Nations, but I know it will be quickly upon us, and I can announce today that Building Nations 2022 will be held at the TSB Arena in Wellington on the 22nd to the 23rd of November, just over a year from today. We're also offering this year's early bird ticketing pricing for those who register by the end of the year. Finally, I want to thank you all for your attendance, your time, and for your engaged and insightful questions of our speakers this week. Infrastructure New Zealand looks forward to continuing to work with you and to advocate on the important issues on the sector's behalf as together we negotiate the fork in the road and the challenges ahead. And just a final note, the Infrastructure New Zealand office will be closed next week and we'll be back on deck from Monday, the 29th of November. Thank you again. And as you've done so magnificently over the last 4 days, I'd like to hand over to Otene for our closing karakia.
Kia ora tātou, kia ora kia koutou e whakarongo ki te kōrero I ngā rā pahure nei. I just want to support Claire in her words of thanks to all those who took part and listened from the early morning until the late afternoon. And so to close our session today, to close the conference, I'm going to use a karakia that our tupuna used when they travelled into unknown territory or on a new journey of discovery to prepare the pathway ahead of them and to draw on their atua for guidance and strength. Kei noi tātou, let us give thanks. Ko te arahau tēnei, kia toka te manawa o te rangi e tūnei. Kia toka, kia māhaki mārire ki tēnei whānau nei e. Pikitia te patu o te rangi, e tohu ana koe. Ko te whiwhinga, ko te rauinga, toku anu, toka hia, renohia, tohu iwi maire. Tohu e kore e taia te tiro, e kōtuku te manu, e kore e raue, e te kuraira, hei kura tākai puna te manu I tūria. Pātiki apu one tangohia ke waiho ana, hei tohu whānau nei e. Tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia teina, haumi e hui e, tai ki e.